The quiet storm in the Canary was in the Grand Tech skyscraper was unlike any other morning in recent memory. The entire executive floor seemed to breathe in unison, like a single organism waiting to exhale. Nathaniel Grant, the enigmatic billionaire behind the technology empire, was finalizing what the media had dubbed the $100 million pivot, a high-stakes merger that would transform his company from a legacy hardware titan into a future-facing AI juggernaut. Cameras weren't allowed inside the boardroom, but the energy was enough to power a city block. Suits were sharper, shoes shinier, coffee orders quadruple. Nathaniel stood at the end of the long walnut conference table, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't just a CEO, he was an institution with silvering temples, a 1,000-yard stare, and a voice as precise as a scalpel. He had built Grand Tech from a garage to the glass monolith in which they now stood. He was many things, a visionary, a strategist, even a widower, but warm. Never. That was what Julia Barnes, his brilliant coup, was for. She was the fire to his frost, the one who could make a room of tech veterans and venture capitalists sit up straighter without ever raising her voice. Nathaniel's eyes didn't leave the portfolio spread open before him. Across the table, Mason Trent adjusted his cufflinks with a confident smirk. He was the investor pushing the merger forward, a man with capital, credentials, and the subtle cruelty of someone who believed money justified anything. Nathaniel wasn't fond of him, but the numbers were undeniable. Trent's backing would ensure Grand Tech not only survived the digital revolution, but led it. "I believe we're ready to proceed," Nathaniel finally said, his tone clipped. Julia handed him a fountain pen, one of Rebecca's favorites, an old Mont Blanc with initials etched in gold. No one knew that. No one was supposed to. As Nathaniel leaned in to sign, a soft voice interrupted the silence. "Sir, wait." The room went still. It wasn't Julia. It wasn't a junior exec or legal advisor. It came from the far corner of the room where no one should have been. Everyone turned, confused. That's when they saw him, Eli Parker, the office boy. He wasn't supposed to be there, and yet there he was, thin, dark curls falling over his forehead, clutching a forgotten binder, his uniform polo slightly untucked, face flushed with embarrassment, but eyes steady. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Mr. Parker, this is a closed meeting." "I know, sir. I was just returning this binder like Miss Julia asked, but I overheard something important." Mason Trent let out a small scoff, like a wolf mocking a house cat. "This is absurd." Eli took a step forward, gripping the binder tighter. "I know I'm nobody here. I'm just the kid who refills the Keurig and empties the shredders. But please, just 5 words. Then I'll leave." The room fell into a stunned, electrified silence. Julia raised a brow but said nothing. Something in the boy's tone, something unfamiliar, had frozen the moment. Even Nathaniel, stone-faced, logical, ruthless, did not speak. Eli swallowed hard. They're lying about the prototype." Mason shifted uncomfortably. Julia's eyes narrowed. Nathaniel, though still a statue, felt something in his gut twist, an instinct he hadn't listened to since Rebecca died. And suddenly, the pen in his hand felt heavier. No one said a word. The silence hung there, bloated and waiting. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Explain." And with that, Eli stepped forward into a moment that would change not only his life, but the very soul of Grand Tech. The binder nobody was supposed to see. There was something unnatural about the way silence spread across that boardroom, like an invisible wave, freezing even the most confident faces mid-expression. Mason Trent, typically the loudest voice in any negotiation, suddenly looked like a man trying to swallow sand. Julia Barnes hadn't blinked in a full 10 seconds, her hand still hovering near her notepad, like the moment hadn't yet given her permission to breathe. And Nathaniel Grant, CEO of Grand Tech, a man whose signature once shifted global markets, hadn't moved since the words left Ellie's mouth. "They're lying about the prototype." 5 words that hit harder than a gavel in a courtroom. Eli Parker stood firm, even as the room's fluorescent lighting made him look smaller, younger, more out of place than he already was. But inside, a slow heat had ignited in his chest, something deeper than adrenaline. Truth. And that was the only thing giving him the courage to continue. "I didn't mean to listen," Eli began, voice shaky but not apologetic. "But yesterday, I was cleaning up after that late-night strategy session in the West Wing conference room. I was just picking up coffee cups and wiping the table When I noticed someone had left their USB plugged into the screen, I thought I'd eject it and return it. But when I tapped the touchpad, a presentation opened. A version of the prototype presentation. Mason let out a sharp, performative laugh. This is ridiculous. Are we really taking investment advice from the janitorial staff now? Nathaniel finally moved, his eyes cutting toward Mason with precision. Let him speak. Eli nodded, heart hammering but words becoming more certain. It wasn't the same as the one we've been presenting today. The specs were watered down, some features removed, others exaggerated. But one slide caught my attention. It showed a different AI model benchmark, one that failed the security test simulations. But the version you're signing today claims full clearance. I saved a screenshot. I know I shouldn't have. Something didn't feel right. Julia's fingers moved swiftly across her tablet, searching internal logs. Her face darkened. Eli, she said, calm but firm. Who was in that late meeting? Eli hesitated. Mason Trent. And the people I didn't know, contractors. Maybe. They wore visitor badges. I only caught the name Krieger on one of their portfolios. Nathaniel's gaze locked with Julia's. No words were needed. She stood and left the room, phone already dialing as the door whispered shut behind her. Mason adjusted his tie, a bit of panic leaking into his carefully constructed mask. This is a gross overreaction. Nathaniel, are we really going to let a teenage intern derail a $100 million deal? Nathaniel turned toward Eli, studying him not as a child, but as something else entirely, perhaps the one person in the room who had nothing to lose. You said you saved a screenshot. Yes, sir, Eli replied, pulling a small USB from his pocket. Encrypted. My uncle taught me how. He used to work cybersecurity in the Navy. Nathaniel took the drive and nodded once. Sit tight. He left the boardroom without another word, and for a moment, everyone sat paralyzed in their chairs. No one dared to speak. Even Mason, fuming in silence, didn't move. The air itself seemed unsure how to fill the space Eli had just cracked wide open. The binder in his hand, the one he had initially entered the room to return, still bore the name confidential, prototype release, final dossier. It hadn't been meant for delivery. It had been deliberately removed from circulation. Down the hallway, Nathaniel entered his private data lab and loaded the USB into a sandbox computer. As the presentation opened, his chest tightened. Eli had been right, not just about the inconsistencies, but about something worse. The original prototype included code Nathaniel had insisted be removed after Rebecca's death, a security failsafe meant to prevent mass misuse of AI-controlled automation. He remembered fighting to remove it from every bill. Now, here it was, still embedded. He sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the screen, his reflection looking back at him with the weariness of a man who trusted too many wolves. In sheep's clothing, Mason had overridden the safety protocol without approval. For what? Expedited release, higher margins, competitive advantage. The cost would have been catastrophic. Back in the boardroom, Julia returned before Nathaniel did, tablet in hand. Background checks on Krieger confirmed he was blacklisted from a major AI firm 2 years ago after multiple data ethics violations. Somehow, he's now listed as a contractor under Mason's secondary LLC. That alone could tank the deal in legal review. Mason's face finally cracked. This is all hearsay. You don't have proof. The doors opened again, and Nathaniel walked back in, USB still in hand. No, he said quietly, but I do have code. Embedded backdoor scripts. You lied to me, Mason. There was no grand outburst, no shouting match, just a quiet unraveling of power as Mason's empire began to rot from the center outward. Nathaniel handed the binder back to Eli, almost reverently. You saw what none of us did. You paid attention. Eli looked stunned. I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir. You didn't. You stopped it, Nathaniel replied, voice lower than anyone had ever heard it, and maybe reminded me of who I used to be. Echoes in the executive suite. Next morning, Grand Tech's top floor didn't hum with the usual pre-meeting buzz. It pulsed with something quieter, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. Word had traveled fast. Mason Trent's deal had been frozen, his contract files locked down by internal audit, and his access revoked overnight. Employees arrived with security badges blinking red instead of green, and whispered theories filled break rooms like thick fog. But behind the polished conference doors, a storm had begun to take a different shape. Nathaniel Grant stood in front of the massive glass wall in his office, the city stretching below him like a map of everything he'd built and everything he had nearly let fall. In his hand, the Mont Blanc pen sat untouched, cold metal against warmer skin. He hadn't slept much, not out of panic or rage, but something more unsettling, reflection. It had been years since anyone had challenged him, without personal gain, years since he'd heard truth from someone with nothing to lose. And that truth hadn't come from a shareholder or consultant or even Julia. It had come from Eli Parker, a kid barely old enough to vote. Nathaniel had reviewed the prototype presentation for times. Before sunrise each time, his stomach turned. At the buried code, Mason and Krieger had tried to slip past him. Worse than the technical risks was the betrayal itself, a quiet disregard for Grantech's values. In the name of speed and profit, Rebecca would have caught it, he thought. She always had a way of seeing people. She would have seen through Mason in an instant. He missed her wisdom now more than ever, and yet, strangely, her voice echoed faintly through Ellie's courage. As if summoned by thought, Julia stepped into the room, her expression unreadable, but her movements precise. Audit is nearly complete, she said. Legal flag Trent's involvement in 3 separate breaches of due diligence were clean. But if you signed Nathaniel, this would have blown up within months. He nodded but said nothing. Also, she continued, about the boy with Eli. Nathaniel turned slightly, meeting her gaze. HR says he's been here 3 months. High school internship through a workforce readiness program. Lives on the south side. Straight a student. Works part-time to help support his mom, divorced, recovering from surgery. No disciplinary marks. Apparently reads our white papers in his free time. Nathaniel raised a brow. He reads internal white papers for fun. He printed your 2018 keynote on ethical AI and highlighted it, Julia replied, holding up the evidence, a stapled bundle of yellowed printouts. Underline the part where you said, technology must answer to conscience, not capital. Something shifted in Nathaniel's face, not quite a smile, but the barest flicker of regret and recognition. Bring him in, he said. Minutes later, Eli stepped into the executive suite again, but this time not as an errand boy. He stood straighter, though his hands still fidgeted at his sides. The nervous habit of someone taught to stay out of grown-up rooms. Nathaniel didn't make him wait. You showed courage yesterday. Not many do. I owe you a debt, Nathaniel said directly, his voice more human than Eli had ever heard. I wasn't trying to be brave, Eli admitted. I was just scared something bad would happen if I didn't say something. That's usually how real bravery works, Nathaniel murmured. He motioned toward the small seating area by the window. Eli hesitated, then sat. Nathaniel paced slowly. You saw something, you acted. You saved this company from a very expensive mistake, but more importantly, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten: why I started Grantech in the first place. It wasn't about margins or mergers. It was about building something better than what I inherited. He paused, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Tell me something, Eli. Why do you care about this stuff? Why not just do your job? Punch the clock, go home. Eli glanced down, then back up. Because of my dad. He was a systems engineer. Got laid off from 3 different companies in 5 years because they replaced humans with automation. Said the tech itself wasn't the enemy, it was the way people used it. He used to say, machines are only as fair as the people programming them. He died last year. I guess I wanted to believe that somewhere, someone still listened. 2 voices like his. Nathaniel looked away, clearing his throat, as if the skyline might offer an answer. The boy had said more in one paragraph than some executives said in entire retreats. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something powerful and humbling, the weight of being seen, not by analysts or competitors, but by a kid who still believed ethics had a place in the world. Effective immediately, Nathaniel said, straightening, you're not just the office boy. We're creating a junior ethics fellow program first. Position is yours, part-time, paid. You'll work under our lead AI ethics officer, and you'll sit in on bi-weekly R&D meetings. Eli blinked. You're serious? I don't offer things I don't mean. And a binder. Nathaniel smiled faintly. You'll keep that. A reminder that sometimes the smallest voice in the room holds the biggest truth. The skeletons behind the server racks. Weeks had passed since the boardroom blow-up, and the buzz that had once dominated the halls of Grantech slowly gave way to a steadier rhythm. Something more purposeful. The canceled merger, once seen as A financial disaster was now being reinterpreted as a course correction. Stocks had dipped briefly, but rebounded stronger. Fueled by investor confidence in Grantech's long-term values, media coverage had shifted to what was initially painted as a botched billion-dollar deal now carried a more inspiring headline: the teen intern who saved an empire. But deep within the layers of celebration and corporate realignment, not everything was resolved. Julia Barnes knew it. Nathaniel Grant definitely knew it, and Eli Parker, now seated in a modest intern workspace just 2 doors down from Grantech's AI ethics division, felt it humming beneath the surface like a warning in code only a few could read. Eli had taken to his new role with quiet intensity. He devoured everything: papers on bias and algorithms, transcripts from global AI ethics conferences, and confidential meeting notes Julia had cleared him to access. What he lacked in age, he made up for in awareness. Every sentence he read was filtered through the lens of his father's struggles, displacement by tech, the loss of dignity, and the stubborn belief that ethics weren't optional. That belief became a compass, especially now that he was being asked to sit in real R&D meetings where engineers debated not just how powerful an AI system should be, but how responsible. Then came a folder and label, tucked into a neglected drawer in the corner of the old development wing where archived prototypes were stored. Eli had wandered in looking for a misplaced design spec, but what he found instead was a binder covered in dust, without a barcode or any traceable digital counterpart. Curiosity got the better of him. When he cracked it open, what he saw inside chilled him. Blueprints, not the sleek kind found in marketing decks. These were raw, annotated, and most of all scrapped. They showed an early model of Grantech's autonomous systems, particularly one centered on predictive decision-making in security networks. The model was years ahead of its time, but the notes scribbled along the margins told a different story. Autonomy threshold unstable, override authority loop flawed, projected to mimic racial bias under high-stress environments. At worst of all, next to the project name Argus V0.6, a short note in red ink, deemed ethically non-viable. Hold for silence. Eli felt the hairs rise on his arms. Hold for silence. What did that even mean? Who wrote that? And why was a project this sensitive buried and not decommissioned? He rushed to Julia's office. She'd just wrapped a call when Eli stepped in without knocking, something he never did. "I found something," he said. "It's serious." Julia saw the look on his face and immediately gave him the floor. Eli handed over the binder. She flipped through it, her eyebrows knitting tighter with every page. "This shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Why is it?" Eli asked, already knowing the answer was the kind people didn't say out loud. "I don't know," Julia said, after a pause, "but I'm going to find out." Later that evening, Julia and Nathaniel sat across from one another in the glass-walled executive lounge, the city bleeding gold and purple through the skyline. Between them, the binder lay open on the table, as damning as it was dangerous. "I sign off on the project freeze," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "I remember it. We buried Argus after the ethics team failed it twice. But I don't remember authorizing a silent hold." Julia leaned back, looking tired for the first time in years. "That phrase isn't ours. It's not standard anywhere in Grantech's documentation. Someone added it later, off the books." Nathaniel looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. "So someone kept it alive, without oversight." "You think Mason knew. I think Mason didn't work alone. He never did." The words hung there like fog. It wasn't just about a failed prototype anymore. It was about control, about the parts of a company that drift when no one watches. The shadows. Meanwhile, Eli, unable to sleep, sat on the floor of his mother's small apartment, flipping through his notebook filled with insights, diagrams, and quotes from engineers and philosophers alike. One line from a TED Talk on ethical development had stuck with him. "Ethics is not what we do once we reach power, it's what we must carry to survive it." He didn't know what he'd stumbled on exactly, but he felt it in his chest like gravity that something bigger, darker, and older had been growing behind the polished walls of Grantech. And now it was his turn to decide what kind of voice he would be. Because if someone had tried to bury Argus in silence, then silence wasn't an option anymore. What the cameras never saw, there are moments when a company must choose between protecting its image and protecting its soul. That was the unspoken truth hovering over every closed-door meeting at Grantech as Nathaniel, Julia, and Eli pored over the Argus files late into the night. What they had discovered wasn't merely a forgotten prototype, it was a decision that had been deliberately concealed, possibly by members of GrandTech's own board. The implications went beyond negligence. They bordered on institutional betrayal. Someone had authorized continued development of a high-risk AI system that the ethics division had unanimously rejected. Worse, the system's data sets, especially those tied to real-time surveillance predictions, revealed a stunning bias ratio when tested against low-income and minority zip codes. That wasn't just bad code. That was moral failure, engineered. For convenience, Julia moved like someone in battle mode, meeting with compliance, pulling archived meeting notes, and tracking down ex-contractors who'd once touched Argus under aliases. Every day she peeled back another layer, and with each layer, it became clearer that the rot ran deeper than expected, and every time they hit another dead end, Eli was there connecting dots they hadn't noticed, spotting inconsistencies in logs, finding phrases that reappeared in ghost files long deleted from the public side of the server. He wasn't just an intern anymore. He had become a thread puller in a sweater everyone else was too afraid to unravel. Then came the access logs. Julia's assistant had uncovered a string of nighttime entries into the prototype lab, always between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., always from a generic admin passkey that was no longer active in the system. The logs traced back months. Someone had been maintaining Argus, testing it, keeping it alive. When they finally cross-referenced the access schedule against badge metadata, one name emerged from the noise: Raymond Dorn, a quiet VP in research who had retired voluntarily just 6 weeks before the Mason deal exploded. Nathaniel stared at the printout, jaw clenched. I never trusted him. Julia raised an eyebrow. Then why keep him? Nathaniel sighed. Because he did his job well, and because I stopped believing people would tell me the truth unless I paid them to. Eli, who had been silent until now, looked up. But you hired me. You didn't have to. Nathaniel met his eyes. No, Eli, I didn't. But I think you were the first person who didn't have a number attached to your words. What came next wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calculated, quiet, the way real change often begins. They traced Raymond Dorn's connections, discovering a shell consultancy he had launched just after leaving GrandTech. The website was vague, the services broader than they needed to be. But nestled in the partner BIOS was the name Krieger, the same advisor Mason had brought to that closed-door meeting weeks before. The pattern was undeniable. What GrandTech had buried ethically, Dorn and his allies had tried to resurrect externally, using the merger as a disguise to slip Argus back in under a new name. And that's when Nathaniel made his decision. He didn't call PR. He didn't call legal. He called the board. The emergency session took place late on a Thursday. The top floor was cleared. No assistants. No assistants. No scripts. Just the 13 people who had the power to steer the future of GrandTech, and the man who had founded it standing at the head of the long, white marble table. Nathaniel didn't open with pleasantries. He opened with a projection. On the screen, behind him, line after line of code pulsed across like evidence in a courtroom. He walked them through Argus's original purpose, its failure, its silence. Then he detailed its resurrection, its bias scores, and the names of those who had helped conceal its return. He showed the access logs, the shell company, Krieger's relationship to Dorn, Mason's involvement, every piece laid out like a spine waiting to be broken. And then, to a room full of stunned power brokers, he did something no one expected. He stepped aside and let Eli speak. Eli didn't fumble. He didn't freeze. He spoke in paragraphs, not bullet points. He explained what ethics meant from the ground up. He described how it felt watching companies discard people like his dad in the name of progress. And then he looked around the room and said something none of them would forget. People don't lose trust in technology because of glitches. They lose it when they see leaders look the other way. When you bury mistakes instead of learning from them, this company has a chance to be different. But only if it starts by telling the truth even when it's ugly. When he finished, no one clapped. But no one looked away. Nathaniel stepped forward again, his tone final. We can either be the company that builds the future or the one history buries in shame. I've made my choice. I'm reinstating full transparency protocols, ordering a public ethics review, and launching an internal task force to audit every AI product under our roof. Eli Parker will be part of that task force, not as an intern, as a co-chair. There were no objections. The legacy you don't see on paper sun rose slower than usual. On the morning of the company-wide town hall, that's how it felt, at least, to the employees gathering on Grand Tech's open-air terrace overlooking the Chicago River. Every employee had been invited no matter their rank, department, or title. From the engineers who designed core processors to the cafeteria cooks who'd stayed after hours during deadlines. It was the first time in years the entire company had been asked to gather in person, not for a product launch, not for a shareholder briefing, but for something far rarer in corporate America, an apology. And a reckoning dot at the center of the stage stood Nathaniel Grant, not in a suit, not with a prepared speech, but in a navy pullover and jeans, weathered by weeks of soul-searching. Beside him stood Eli Parker, no longer in an intern's polo, but a fitted gray jacket over a white shirt and familiar clothes, but a familiar calm in his eyes. To his other side stood Julia Barnes, still sharp and composed, but for the first time visibly proud. Together, they formed a triangle of past, present, and possible future. Nathaniel stepped to the microphone. There was no booming music or special effects, just truth. I built Grand Tech out of a garage with a dream to change the world. He began, his voice quieter than usual, as if confessing instead of presenting. And somewhere along the way, I started believing that growth would protect us from compromise, that speed would shield us from questions, that profits would forgive silence. I was wrong. He took a deep breath. We've discovered that one of our early AI security prototypes, Argus, was quietly revived under unauthorized hands. That it carried the same ethical flaws we once rejected, flaws that could have caused harm to the very people technology is meant to serve. This didn't happen under a competitor. It happened here, in our own walls, and it nearly got sold to the world, wrapped in a billion-dollar deal. Because I stopped looking closely, the crowd was silent, many stunned. This wasn't a carefully PR package admission. It was raw. Nathaniel continued. It wasn't an executive who stopped it. It wasn't a board member. It wasn't our PR team or our investors. It was a 17-year-old intern who noticed something didn't feel right. And he said 5 words that changed the course of this company. They're lying about the prototype. He turned to Eli, gesturing him forward. Eli hesitated for only a second, then stepped to the mic, his voice carrying not through volume, but through sheer conviction. I didn't plan to speak up. I was scared. I thought if I told the truth, I'd lose my job or worse, get blamed. But then I thought about my dad. He spent most of his life being replaced by the very systems he once helped build. I thought about how many people don't get to walk into these buildings. How many of them are told technology is too complicated, or that progress doesn't wait for feelings. But what good is progress if it steps on people just trying to live decent lives? He looked across the sea of faces, eyes wide, alert, searching. You don't have to be rich to speak up. You don't need a title to be right. You just need the moment and the guts to use it. And if this company, with all its money and reach and power, is brave enough to listen to people like me, then maybe, just maybe, it really can build something that matters. There was no eruption of applause. Not right away. Just stillness, the kind of deep, soul-hitting stillness that comes when truth is finally louder than the noise. Then came the claps tentative at first, then rising into a standing ovation. Not because the problem had been solved, but because someone had finally admitted it existed. In the days that followed, things didn't return to normal. Grand Tech launched its first internal integrity platform, a confidential feedback system, powered by transparent AI that allowed every employee, from janitor to executive, to flag ethical concerns without fear of retaliation. Eli, now officially promoted to Director of Ethical Foresight, helped train teams on ethical risk detection, sometimes quoting sci-fi movies, sometimes just asking the right questions no one else did. Nathaniel began visiting departments in person, not to audit, to listen. His office door, once symbolic of unreachable power, now stayed cracked open most days. He also wrote an open letter titled The Value of Being Interrupted, which The Atlantic published in full, crediting the story that had started with a whisper. Julia became the face of the company's new ethics-first initiatives, speaking on panels where she used to only discuss numbers. At one such event, she said, "If your systems can't stand up to a teenager with a binder and a conscience, then they were never strong to begin with." As for Eli, he didn't change in the ways people expected. He still took the bus to work, still brought his mom herbal tea during her treatments, still carried a tattered notebook full of underlined quotes and diagrams. But what changed was how people looked at him, not as an intern, not even as a prodigy, but as a mirror reminding everyone who encountered him that sometimes the person asking the simplest question is the one protecting everyone from the biggest mistake. That when a new group of high school interns arrived that summer, unsure of where they fit in a towering building of high-stakes decisions, it was Eli who greeted them at the front lobby. No security detail, no grand introduction, just a clipboard and a smile. "Welcome to Grand Tech," he said. "You're going to be heard here."